Thank you for letting me take y'all to church for that song. As I mentioned in one of our earlier sessions, religion, going to church is such a huge part of the Black community. And I swear you can only find a voice like that in a Black church. So I felt like I had to bring some of that energy into our celebration today and into our session as well. So first off, welcome to this final session of Bottom Line's first annual Juneteenth celebration. Some of you have been with us since the beginning of today. Some are just tuning in, but you are all, of course, welcome. For those who don't know me, my name is Alexandra, and I work on the career team out of our New York office, and I'm going to be your host for this session. We're really excited about this panel. I know we still have some folks signing in. So as you sign in, please remember to mute yourselves, turn off your videos as well if they're not already turned off, your videos so that the panelists can clearly be seen. And while we wait for people to finish signing in, I want to start us off with a little bit of an icebreaker. So I'm going to ask you guys to respond to the following prompt in the chat. On a scale of 0 to 5, how comfortable are you with talking about race? So rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 5 with how comfortable you are talking about race, with 0 being I'd rather not talk about it, to 5 being I am very comfortable talking about it. Go ahead, just drop a number in the chat. We'll take a look and sort of read the room a little bit. There are no right answers. Everybody is here to engage in conversation and learn from one another. I see someone posted an 8 on a scale of 0 to 5. I like that energy. Thank you to those who are putting in those 2s. Not quite I don't want to talk about it, but it's hard to talk about. I appreciate that, and I hear that for sure. Even as a Black woman, it can be very hard to talk about as well. So you're not alone in that. Definitely see a lot of 4s, a lot of 3 to 4 ranges and 5s as well. So that's great. Depends on the context. That's very important too. We're definitely a society where some things you don't talk about with certain people just because you already know how that conversation might go, or it's just not something you're comfortable with at the time. So definitely hear that. For anyone who's just joining us, we're responding to a prompt in the chat to rate how comfortable you are talking about race on a scale of 0 to 5, with 0 being I'd rather not talk about it, and 5 being I'm very comfortable. So go ahead, I'll give about 1 more minute for people to respond as we wait for final folks to trickle in. Mostly with other people of color, that makes sense for sure. I hear it. See some 3s coming in. 3 is probably my favorite answer anytime I'm asked to rate something, because it's very neutral. It's kind of non-committal, not to call anybody out, but sometimes when I can't quite, when one of those feels just a little too intense, I kind of go with that 3, so I hear it. I hear it. All right, well, thank you to everyone who responded. Feel free, that's a great point, being comfortable talking about it and listening to it, but not wanting to take up space meant for people of color. Appreciate you putting that out there. Go ahead, browse the chat, look at other people's reflections. While you do so, I'm just gonna kick us off. As y'all know, we have a really exciting mix of panelists for you this afternoon. But before I have them introduce themselves, I briefly want to go over the norms that we use internally at Bottom Line when engaging in discussion and learning spaces. So the 4 norms that we're going to focus on today are respect others. That's key, just us all being human beings, just generally, but particularly in this space where conversation might get difficult. Listen actively, for sure. This is a learning environment. we all have things to share, but we all have room to grow. Take risks, but recognize limits. There's been a lot of upheaval recently in the Black community, a lot of death. There have been a lot of protests, and I know that it's not only the Black community that is angry about what is happening. So participate as much as you feel comfortable. If you feel the need to step back a little bit from the conversation, that's all right too. And then, of course, last but not least, challenge ideas, not people. As I said, we're here to learn and grow from one another. We know that we're in a learning space, so let's keep that at the forefront of our minds as we move through today. As I mentioned before, I know that sort of as a polite society, we often shy away from heavy topics like race, but I want us to use today to lean into some of that comfort and use this as an opportunity to learn and grow from one another. That said, I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves really briefly, so you guys can tell us your name, your current role, and a brief background of any relevant social justice work that you'd like to share, and then any aspects of your identity that you would like us to know. Anyone in particular want to kick it off?
Sure, I can go first.
Awesome.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. My name is Lily Wandusin. I am a Bottom Line alum, first and foremost. I currently work at Pfizer as a Global Health and Patient Access as a manager for their corporate responsibility group, but now we're currently called Global Health and Patient Access. I'm happy to talk about what that means offline, so if you have any questions, please let me know. In terms of identifying myself, I like to identify myself as an Ethiopian American woman. I was born in Ethiopia, but I've been in the country for about 20 years. And so it's been interesting just identifying and having that dual identity in this crisis. In terms of the social justice work, I'm a fierce advocate for maternal health care in developing countries, and enjoy uplifting the voices of our women, specifically in East Africa.
Very good.
Thanks, Lily. I also want to introduce myself. My name is Charlene Lansico. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, and I'm currently in Brooklyn right now. I am a Afro-Caribbean American. So my mom is from Haiti and my dad is from St. Lucia. And so that's how I identify myself. But I also identify myself as an African American as well, and just Black. So there's a lot of different identities. I've done a lot of social justice work. I went to NYU, and while I was at NYU, I helped to create a mentorship program for young women of color, and it's still going on right now. It's called NYU Reaching Out, and that program definitely helped me throughout my college years, and I'm very passionate about mentoring young women of color and women in general. And I also was a director for the Sadie Dash Leadership Project, which also does a lot of social justice work in regards to young women of color. And so that is my main focus.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
I can go next. I'm Max Claremont. Born and raised in Boston, Latin Academy and Bottom Line class of 2007. I'm now in the western part of the state, but I've lived a whole bunch of different places. Most of my career, I have a background in public health, but most of my career has been focused on trying to change our political leadership and changing who makes decisions. And so I spent a couple years co-founding an organization called Data for Black Lives in Boston. And now I work for the mayor of Holyoke, who is embarking on a congressional campaign in the western part of the state.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Hey, y'all. This is Elizabeth Wynn, she and her good. I work for the National Bail Fund Network, a network of folks who do community-based interventions in the criminal punishment system and also the immigration system. And I'm also a volunteer with a local immigration bond fund here in Boston. not from Boston, grateful to have been here for about 10 years, born and raised in the South and the Midwest. On my father's side, Vietnamese. He was a refugee who came to this country. My mother's side, white, Irish, German, from Seneca Nation land. And just glad to be here. Have learned so much over many years from young people doing work for social justice.
Thank you for joining us today.
I also forgot to tell you guys my role. I think I didn't say I'm actually a nurse, so I forgot that part, but I just wanted to clear that up. Thank
you. So as I said, we have an amazing mix of people on our panel today, and we're going to jump right in so that we can get to the heart of the matter. So just a quick note of logistics. We're going to start with some of the moderated questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. When we open up to the audience, we'll invite you to come off camera to ask your question yourself. So my first question is for Max, Charlene, and Lily. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about how you define an ally. What does an ally look like to you? And can someone who is non-Black, because that's what our focus is for today, can they self-define themselves as an ally, or is this a title that should be given to them?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think I personally identify an ally as someone who is not a representative of underserved communities, who takes an active role and leverages their privilege and power to uplift people who may not have the same opportunity given to them, given to other people in their company. And I like to think that a lot of the decisions and the calibrations and the money moves are discussed behind closed doors. And those people tend to be people that don't look like us, and have extreme privilege and power. And you can certainly be an ally by just using your opportunity to mention someone that's doing a great work and building that reputation for them by just voicing or name dropping them in that meeting room, where you can be a sponsor or a champion for them. You don't even have to be a self-defined ally, but by just doing that, you've created a space for them to be highlighted or promoted or given an opportunity to be challenged in the different parts of their role. So I think it doesn't have to be self-defined. It can just be as natural as, dropping a name or congratulating them on the work that they do, not microaggression way, but for the sake of the fact that they actually did a great job. So I think it doesn't have to be self-identified. It can actually just be something that you do naturally within your day-to-day.
Yeah, I agree with the last point about day-to-day. And the one thing I've heard ally mentioned almost so many times in the last couple months or last month than probably the last year. And I think the one thing I want to caution against it is just this idea that it might be like a title, that it might be like some certificate or graduate degree that you get, and really thinking about how there's not really I don't think there's like an endpoint. I think ally is just changing how you thinking about how you use your voice. And I spend a lot of time saying it's okay. Allyship is also just having a lot of questions and not enough answers. And I think the best way to think about allyship is starting with where you are, like your close proximity, thinking about who's around the table, who's not, whose voices get lifted up, and who doesn't, and then thinking about what are you going to do to make it better. And then I think to some extent, thinking about how your allyship continues when folks are not watching, when the stakes are not high, and when you're not getting rewarded for it, or there's no kind of accolade. So I think it's really about behavior, asking questions, digging in and learning, and being honest about what you don't know, and getting close to the people who do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I piggyback on what Lily and Max said. I'm going to open up and say I'm currently dating a white guy, and yesterday we actually had a very deep conversation about allyship, because it was very hard to figure out I think for him, how to hold space for me while at the same time being able to be comfortable in his whiteness. And so one of the things that I talked about was performative social justice work, which is something that I feel I've experienced throughout just friendships and just people in general. And so I cautioned him not to do things that were performative. So one of the things he had asked me was, you know, should I post something on Facebook? Like how do you want me to kind of address, you know, the things that are happening right now in America? And I personally don't have social media. I'm not against people who do, but I don't have it just because when I did have it, I found myself to be performative as well. And so I think sometimes performative social justice work is not just about white people doing allyship work, it's also about people of color can possibly have the role of wanting to do allyship but not doing it correctly, and it becomes self-centered. And so one of the things that I told him, because I am a devout Christian, is doing the heart work and making sure that your intentions are pure and that it's coming from a place of sincerity and not from a place of narcissism. And so that's just something I've been reflecting on. But I think if your heart, if it's coming from the heart, then it's more valuable for me than if it's coming from a place of, oh, look what I'm doing great things for Black people or brown people or people of color, and I'm an ally. So I also don't think that people should necessarily say I'm an ally. I think it's very tricky when you do that, because what if you interact with another person of color and they don't feel like you're an ally? So I think it's a very complex word to use, and I think it's sometimes used inappropriately.
I think you guys bring up some really great points in response to that question. One of them just being the idea of allyship as a continuous process. It's not like, oh, I did these 5 acts, now I can be considered an ally and my work is done. It's a constant state of showing up, creating space, putting people's names forward, and uplifting. So I appreciate you guys bringing that. Charlene, I especially resonate with that idea of performative allyship, performative social justice. It's definitely something that even I myself have struggled with. Something I mentioned in another session is how, you know, I see everyone going out to protest and putting their physical body on the line, and I have never felt like that is a space that I wanted to put myself in. And so how do I, as a Black woman who is directly affected by everything that goes on, showing up for my community and creating space for other people to also show up and have voice? So thank you for bringing up those points, and that kind of leads me into my next question. If you or Max or Lily can share a successful example of allyship that you've either witnessed or were on the receiving end of.
Max, you wanna go?
I just wanted to respond. Yeah, I'll respond to that in a second, but I'm with you on the protest thing. I got many invitations to go to the protest, but I'm not a protest person. But you'll find me on the other end when you come back from the protest, and you'll see me the days after to see if whatever you did at the protest, whatever sign you held, are you putting it into practice, right? And are you thinking about not just showing up for the protest, tagging your people on social media, but like the stuff I talked about earlier, kind of like how you continue this kind of work, because that performative stuff is tricky. But I also think I also view going to a protest as an action of allyship. I think putting yourself at risk is allyship. Putting the black square on Instagram for Blackout Tuesday, that's not a bad thing to do. And so I think that's important. Examples of allyship, it's interesting because the tough part for me over the last, and we talked about this in the pre-remarks, has been like, I lead a team that's like 95% white. And I think because I'm the leader, I think there's some questions to ask. Hey, like, you had control over the representation here, and it still ended up being white, which is something I should think about. But But I think there's been this responsibility, like when this stuff is going on, for you to be the person that helps. You have to lead this team, but also be the person that's helpful in helping them educate themselves and pointing them to materials, but also trying to figure out the best way to kind of deal with this stuff on your own. And one of the things that that happened recently was the candidate I worked for, the mayor, Alex Morris, decided to like organize a meeting where I wasn't included, and basically brought all the white people together and said, and intentionally left me out the meeting. It was like, hey, we're gonna convene and talk about amongst ourselves about the kind of work we need to do and what this moment means and how we respond as a team, and not putting the burden on Max because he's the black guy here to be the one who like leads and guides. And I thought that was, I didn't tell him to do that. I didn't ask him to do that, but like him like stepping up in that way was powerful. And the great thing is the person who's gonna like, that the fact that he's involved and other people are taking ownership of this, and like I'm not the one who needs to review statements about Juneteenth that are going out today. I'm not the one who needs to think about how we respond to this protest, but that everyone's thinking about doing the education they need to respond to it, and not like, oh, let's run this by Max. Let's do our own work so we can like represent this issue in the way that it needs to be represented. I thought that was powerful.
Yeah, for me, I think, so I work for a huge pharma company, which on itself is going through an interesting time with COVID and addressing, the vaccine issue and things like that. So for me, allyship came in the form of being a young person in my company. A lot of the folks that were working at Pfizer, that are working at Pfizer, have been with the company for 10 plus years. Folks on my team have been on my team for 20 plus years. So it came in the form of, she's a very young person, but she's a lot to offer, even though she might not have the exposure, the tenure, the experiences that a lot of the people had on this team. And so, a couple of months ago, I had two great opportunities that were presented to me. One, I knew for sure was fiercely advocated by an ally that wasn't my manager, and my manager is actually Black. So it came in the form of basically coming with a cohort of people that were deemed to be, were on the right track to be successful and wanted to be retained with the company, and they were called get to know people. And so it was colleagues who were deemed to be effective workers, and that leadership should get to know them. And so that was, for me, a really great exposure to get to know some of the LT members. And the other was essentially going on a 3-week trip to Ghana to assess the marketing plan and health needs for a maternal health care clinic. So those things I know for sure were fiercely advocated for me, even though I was less than a year within the company. And a lot of people came to me and said, how did you get this opportunity? You haven't been here for even a year. And so I appreciated someone sticking out their neck for me, telling me I'm capable, even though I haven't been here as long as some of my other colleagues. So I think I still face that, struggle of being young, Black, and a woman at a big corporate company, but I appreciate the allies.
Charlene, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Lily and Max said. I also wanted to kind of share a quick anecdote of something that I had experienced while I was at Yale. I had a couple of racist experiences, and I do remember one particular young white woman that was a great ally for me, and the way that she was able to do that for me was when I was in certain situations that were uncomfortable and I didn't want to speak up about certain things because I didn't want to be that angry Black woman or all the other stereotypes that sometimes comes with what it means to be Black. She would stand in that space for me, and not in the way of speaking for me, but communicating to her other white friends how certain things may make me feel. And so sometimes it's easier for white people to educate other white people about what they're doing than for me as a Black woman to do that kind of education, because that's taxing for me emotionally. And also because of white supremacy, there's this kind of, stereotype that Black people don't know what they're talking about. So in being an ally, being able to use that privilege to help communicate some of the things that I could also communicate, but I am not able to because of the fact that I'm a Black woman.
Thank you. I think you all raised such important points. Really just this idea of Black people sort of always being the representative of their race in whatever space that they're in, and having to sort of sign off on things or being the voice of yay or nay, not just as a person, but as, like I am Black America, essentially, and just the emotional weight and totally, as you said, that puts on us. And I appreciate that idea of asking people who are truly allies to step into that education space. And so if they witness a moment where that burden is being put on us to speak from that place, not to speak from our place, but to speak in support of an allyship. So I appreciate all of those thoughts that you just shared. I have one final question before I turn it over to the audience to get some of their questions up. And this one I'd like to ask to Elizabeth. This question was actually submitted by one of our attendees in advance. I wanted to ask it specifically to you as a woman of color who is also white presenting. This person asks that they found with conversations with white family and friends that they always tend to move through predominantly white spaces, whether it's where they work, whether they've gone to school, where they lived, and not because they're necessarily trying to other themselves, but just because it's what's familiar, so it's where they're comfortable. So what are some ways they might be able to be intentional about diversifying the spaces that they move through?
Yeah, thank you. I want to say a few things about the question. So that is by design. In this country, white supremacy has shaped the structures of our lives, from where we live to where we go to school, to what form of transportation we take, to where we work. Many of us are part of trying to transform that and change that, but it's not an accident that many people experience themselves as being surrounded by people, particularly white folks or upper class wealthy white folks, being surrounded by other upper class wealthy white folks. And I think it's really important to understand that that's not an accident, that that's how this country has been shaped since the genocide of indigenous people here and since the enslavement of African folks to build the wealth of this nation. I think diversity is really complex. Robert Diaz, who is an anti-racism trainer, sometimes says, what can be an intense thing to hold, but she'll say the plantation was a diverse workplace, and that it's not about diversity in terms of identities, it's about who has power. And I think in our contemporary context, like we could say our prisons are really diverse, or our farms are really diverse, or the places where fish is processed, or the places where things are cleaned are really diverse. But who has the power in those contexts, and whose rights and thriving and survival is given the most priority. So I think I push back a little on the idea that like diversity is our goal. I think exposure to many truths in the world is really important, but in my mind, liberation and justice are our goal. And for some of us, that means widening the truths and life experiences that we're exposed to. But I think we need to be really careful about the trap that the presence of people of different races, sexual orientations, class backgrounds, gender expressions, that the presence means that we've reached liberation or equity.
Thank you. I think you made such an important point about it's not just the identities that we hold, but it's the distribution of power and how we are able to have our voices heard and mattered in those spaces. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to, because unfortunately we have a limited time, I feel like we could have a panel on this literally all day and never run out of things to talk about, but I want to open it up to the audience and see if anyone has a question they would like to ask the panelists. Just go ahead and raise your hand, and we will invite you to come off mute and share your screen so we can see your face as you ask. All right, I see Jaden has their hand up. I shouldn't assume, I apologize for that. Jaden, why don't you go ahead?
All right, so I really don't look presentable now because of the quarantine, but I actually had a question for Max. I want to get into politics, but I'm actually having like a hard time of like where to start exactly because I'm actually going to graduate college within the coming year. So I wanted to know like any advice or like any pointers you can give for someone that's because I'm 20 years old. I'm going to be 21 within like 5 to 6 months. What advice could you give me on like getting my foot in the door or just really like learning about it, like learning how to maneuver through the entire system of it?
Great. No, I think it's when I think about the problems we have as a country and what it's going to take to match, make sure we have, the right scale of solutions. I think there's really a role for political and civic leadership. So it's great that you're thinking about it. It's to be honest, it's really tough. And I think for me, I had a relationships matter a ton. And so I hope we can like kind of get connected after this because I want to learn a little bit more about what your interests are and then figure out how I make sense of the space and people I know and really advocate for you, because it really takes that kind of intentional advocacy to get the support you need. But oftentimes, I think the best place to start is trying to figure out being open-minded about where you go and what you do. I think many people interested in campaigns are like, oh, I want to be a campaign manager, or I want to be a chief of staff, or I want to be, run for office. And I think I love that kind of aspirational stuff, but there's also some part of like getting in there, learning about how systems work, building relationships, because it's a relationship driven. Someone you might be working for today might be doing the hiring for the next job because it's just how folks kind of move around the political space. But I often recommend, especially when you're 2021, especially in a year like this, when you have a lot of campaigns going, a lot of national, like try to work on a campaign. I think the great thing about working on a campaign, presidential, local, is in many cases you might have one title, like you're doing the organizing, or you're working on communications, or you're working on political. But like because teams are kind of dynamic and a lot of moving parts, you get exposed to all different facets of the political world, and you learn a lot about how decisions are made, how money is used, and how policy is made. So I think like starting on a campaign level or starting as an intern in an office is a good thing to do. And then at some point, I think you have to have some clarity around like what issues you care the most about and what are the places where you can have the most influence over that issue and that cause. And so happy to connect offline about how to like actually turn what I said into a plan. But like, I've been in the game since I just turned 31. I know I don't look it, but I've been in the game since about 20 myself. And so I'm happy to be helpful.
Thank you so much. I'll connect with you as well.
Thank you for that question, Jaden. Next question from the audience. I know we have a lot of information that's already been presented and a lot to process.
I had one comment based on something you said, Alexandra, because I think the reason why I'm kind of uncomfortable being the like oh, go to the Black person, because I think I'll fall short, because there's so much depth and breadth to the Black lived experience here and the intersectional identities that and I'm operating from a point of privilege. Like, I have education, I have a graduate degree, I have access to a lot of white people, have access to a lot of power, right? And so, and like, I have to think about, like, because I have a certain amount of privilege, there's ways that I can be a better ally too, and advocate. And so I think the reason why it's hard for me to take on this work of like doing all the education and stuff is it's going to be limited and narrow, and it might not be as comprehensive as like what you need. So like, I'm happy to be part of the team of educators for you and the team of people, but it can't fall all on me, because that's just, I will fall short, because I have my own stuff I'm trying to deal with, and I'm trying to get you to a better place. Mm-hmm. And then I've been watching Good Morning America lately. I don't know why, but I've been starting my mornings with TJ Holmes. And he had a special once, and he said, while all of America is trying to figure out how to survive the pandemic, Black Americans are trying to figure out how to survive the day, right? So like these, like, you know, I went from thinking about the pandemic, thinking about when the hell stuff is going to open up. I'm working on a campaign. So I'm like, when are we going to be able to knock doors? And then George Floyd and Ahmaud, and you're like, wow, now I have to think about how I'm going to survive the day. Mm-hmm. How am I supposed to do all this education, all that stuff for you, when I got to do all that, so learn how to survive the day? So I just think I'll fall short if I get all that responsibility. I'll do my best, but I have to be honest about my own capacity as well, and I think we all do.
Yeah. Something I want to add to that I really want everyone here to hear, particularly non-Black identifying people, is that as a Black person in America, you never get to walk away from this. That fear of whether or not you're going to make it through the day or someone you love is going to make it through the day never actually leaves you. I myself operate from a place of privilege. Like he said, I've traveled extensively. I hold multiple degrees. I speak multiple languages. And at the end of the day, it still comes down to me being a Black woman. And the fact that I can never separate myself from that just puts me in a very different place than non-Black identifying people. So I encourage everyone, you know, when we eventually close for the day, that you hold on to that and take that knowledge back with you into the spaces that you navigate. We do have another hand from the audience. So Darnisha, I'm gonna invite you to ask your question.
All right, my question is for Charlene. Just kind of want your opinion on this, especially being a Christian. I'm also a Christian as well. And so being in the church, you know, it's always been like constant conversation or debate about, you know, is racism a gospel issue? Should this be a conversation should this be an issue that Christians should be in the front lines about, and things like that? But my specific question is, just kind of, what does allyship look like in your opinion in the church, especially of course for you know, non-Black Christians, and is it any different from, you know, allyship with, you know, non-believers who are non-Black?
Thank you so much for that question. I actually help run a Sabbath school group, and so we have these conversations all the time, and we're always learning and growing in terms of how to best make sense of it. I currently go to a multicultural church in New York City, and my pastor is white. And in February, before the movement that we just currently had, we had a book club where we were reading the book, How to Be Anti-Racist. And we had several conversations about it, but I felt what was missing was the Christ part. I felt like there was, I did think the book was useful in many ways, but I thought that there was a lot more for me as a Christian, secular humanism, this idea that as human beings that we're going to be able to fix racism. And personally for me as a Christian, I think that racism is due to the fall of man, and the idea that we are of a sinful nature. And so in terms of how do I address it with non-Black people in church, I think about love. I start there. I start from the root of love and what that means in the Bible. And then also understanding that when you understand how Christ loves us, and also understand how identity impacts human beings in this world. I think being able to combine the two is where I've been able to find some kind of resolve in the issue, is understanding that personally for me, it can be psychologically draining. And so in order to deal with it, I have to understand what love means to me. And so if I practice the love in the Bible, the love that is kind and pure and gentle and of self-control, and I'm able to have those healthy conversations with non-Black people of color, or just white people as well. Because I do think that in terms of allyship, I think the conversation is not always just about white people. It's also non-Black people of color as well. Because I've also had to kind of engage in those conversations, and also Black people, because it's very complex. And so to answer your question, I think when it comes to church and making sense of racism, the best way that I've been able to understand it and make sense of it is coming from a place of love. And I don't think that every person can be an ally. I don't think that everyone is a good person. I do not believe that. I do think that there is evil in this world. And so I'm not naive in the sense that I'm going to think that everyone I'm going to come into contact with is going to want to be an ally, is going to want to fight for racism. I understand that. And so I try my best to make sure I'm interacting with people who generally want to impact and make changes in this world.
Thank you.
Excellent question, excellent thoughts. Any follow-up thoughts on that, or another question from the audience? If not, I do have a question I'd like to ask Max, because you touched on this idea of the privilege that you hold. And so I recognize that you are a Black man in America, but I also recognize that you are a man in America. So I was hoping that you could talk to us a little bit about that intersection of those two different identities and how you sort of navigate those within the spaces you move in.
Yes, that's something I think about a lot. And I think one of the questions I saw was kind of like, Black man, white man, and kind of Black woman, Black man kind of dynamics. And I think in many cases, I think there's I have to be very careful as a Black man in majority white spaces. I literally have to watch the language I use, make sure I don't pop off, and make sure that I'm engaging in people in a way that makes them feel safe, that's not threatening. And so that's something I actually actively think about. I was in a meeting once, and someone on my team mentioned something about slaves, working like slaves. And I was like, excuse me? And I had a reaction, and part of me, I looked back at that, I was like, yo, I wonder if I could have, it was in the middle of a team meeting, she made that reference. And usually I'm a little bit careful, and I kind of let that moment pass and then address it afterwards, one-on-one. But I think it was important for people to see in real time, the impact of that kind of language. And I had to react in a way that was real. But the one thing I think about a lot is in many cases, I've been lucky because I've actually worked at a lot of organizations where Black women are leading. I mean, the nonprofit Day for Black Lives, founded by a Black woman who I have a lot of respect for. I take my orders from Black women in this space, especially in the social justice movement, because when you think about who's recording the videos of the Black men being killed, Black women. When you think about who's bailing them out, who's going to court every day for them, Black women. And so I think, but I also notice, even though they're in places of leadership positions, there are ways that they're undervalued and undermined. And I use my privilege as a male to make sure that I can lift them up, lift up their work, make sure I give visibility to what they're doing, behind the scenes, that people don't recognize and that people don't honor. And so, and then it coming from me as a male, even though I'm in a lower position, makes a difference because I'm a male, right? And it carries more weight. So I actively think about the ways in which I also need to think about, in the same way we talk about white people holding space, like me as a male, making sure I'm not holding up too much space. Even in a panel like this, I love the conference calls that tell you, you get a report back that says how many minutes someone was talking on a conference call, and really pay attention to who's talking and for how long. I think that kind of data, the active kind of, is like important. And I know I have a lot of work to do myself around making sure that like I hold space for others, and like the male privilege and all that stuff. So yeah, I think about that quite a bit.
I just want to emphasize one thing you said, and that's the code switching that we have to do in corporate America. You said I have to hold myself from popping off or talking about things in a certain way, and I think it's truly exhausting to do that. It's truly exhausting to, I think, Alexander, one of your questions was professionalism in the Eurocentric way, and how we have to uphold ourselves to be looked at a certain way or talked to in a certain way, or, projecting our voice. And, turning on that white voice is a real thing when you pick up the phone. And I think in this day and age, it's truly exhausting to bring a different self to work all the time. Where we spend most of our lives is at work 5 days a week, 9 to 5. And to be stripped of our identity constantly is exhausting. And so I think being present and picking up space in your true identity is as critical as being an activist on, protesting or donating or bailing. That's how you push the agenda. That's how you push the culture. And that's how you allow for others to take up space that come after you. And kudos to you, Max, for calling that woman out. I think it's hard because you don't want to get, reprimanded for doing that to her. So I think being authentically you is as important as being on the front protesting social injustice. So I think the list of code switching is exhausting.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that, Lily, and for your thoughts, Max. Everything that you guys said definitely resonates with me. I think that on top of, Black people having to sort of be the teacher in moments like these, we also have to carry that sort of the emotional weight of white fragility. Like, I don't know how else to put it, but just like, we can't offend them. Like, we have to make sure that like we're talking to them in a way that makes them feel comfortable. And it's like, this is uncomfortable stuff to talk about, like if I have to be uncomfortable every day of my life, you can be uncomfortable for the hour it's going to take us to have this conversation, because that's the only way that we're going to move forward. If, you can walk away from this 364 days out of 365, then like you can listen to me for a day and we can engage in real hard conversation. So I appreciate you guys bringing that up because it completely resonates with me. I know it does with a lot of other Black people as well. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So I see that Veranda has her hand raised. So Veranda, why don't you bring yourself off mute and you can ask your question.
Hi. So my question, I think it could be generally answered by everyone on the panel. And I think, my question is, do you think that it's Black people or non-people or non-Black people, so other people of color, to educate white people on what's happening right now and just racism in general? Like, should it fall on us to be able to do so, or should those people be able to like do the research themselves, basically?
I'll start. I want to say that I think it is important for them to do the research themselves, but I think what happens when they do the research is that what I've come to experience is wanting to teach me the knowledge that they have now learned. And so it's more about gaining all of the knowledge, but the application isn't necessarily there. And then there's also this form of like, I know because I read. And so being able to read about it and research and have that understanding, but knowing that you will never actually be able to empathize with a person of color, and being humble in that, and also being open to having conversations with people of color, because you can read several books, but that's the danger of a single story, is that you're only getting one perspective. But when you're able to have conversations with many different people of color, then you have a more broad perspective on what's going on. But even me as a person of color, I still don't know everything. And so being able to do the research, but being humble in the knowledge that you're attaining.
Yeah, everything you said. And on top of that, I almost, because everyone's at such a different place with this, that I almost wish that before folks ask me about resources, and I do my best to use my platform to share. I mean, everything I've tweeted about the last month or so has to have Black in it, and I hope the people who follow me, like, I have a theme, I have a focus right now. That's the only thing I care about. But the second thing is, I wish folks came in. The question you asked in the beginning about 3, 4, 5, I wish everyone had like kind of a score or like a diagnostic test, because I have to, for this to work or for me to be most helpful, I have to know where you're at and where you're not. And to have a sense of like, what do you know, what don't you know? And then also like, what are you most interested in? Because you have to figure out how whatever education they do has to be relevant to them, or like, because especially with the application piece, because if it's like about something that's like too abstract that they can't make real, or they can't sense how to use it in their like day-to-day life, that could be difficult to kind of get it to resonate and for them to apply it in the way that you need them to. So I don't know. I mean, I know there's like some like racism tests that people can take and stuff like that, but like it would be much better for me if I found a way, because these requests are coming often. I'm like, I wish I could give someone some like diagnostic tests so that I can like be more helpful. Because I'm not. It's a balance of knowing where you are and then also understanding what my capacity and knowledge is too. Because in many cases, I might not be able to meet you where you are. It might just be too much work.
Yeah, I like that idea of a diagnostic test. I think there is, we've touched a little bit on this idea of performative acts and, sort of knowing where someone is honestly is good. And so I think there's a danger sometimes that they come looking for validation that they've done the right thing, they've read the right thing, and that's kind of where it stops. So I think, knowing where they really are and where they want to go is a huge part of figuring out if we have the bandwidth or want to, spend the time helping them. So I appreciate that. We do have, I believe, 2 more questions before we end. Edward, you're up next, so why don't you go ahead?
Hi everyone, my name is Edward. I just joined the conversation. I was doing something. I have 2 questions for everyone. So I just finished college and I really didn't know about this day until like a couple of months ago. A lot of people of color do not know about this particular day. So what can we do to raise awareness about this day and how we can change that narrative from us being Black, like knowing our holidays and knowing how important they are. And the second question is, how can we use this moment to kind of heal together as a community, and what ways can we also come together and heal? So I know you guys probably know about futurism, meditation, all these things, but what can we do as a community to come together and learn new ways to kind of like help us heal each other and kind of like come together and find ways to also like heal ourselves and find ways to like fight the system. So those are the 2 questions that I have.
Thanks, Edward. I want to answer your second question about healing our community. As I mentioned, I identify as Ethiopian American, and I think having that dual identity has come into question more than ever right now. As an African descent, a lot of Africans don't think themselves to be Black, unfortunately. And I've had a lot of difficult conversations with my family, extended family, on really understanding the root of why they might not think they're Black and identify as Black Americans. And healing really starts within like your family, educating them why it's important to be an ally to Black people. And I start with, if it wasn't for the people that built this country on their backs, we wouldn't have been able to immigrate to this country to access the American dream. And really making it relatable and bringing it to face value and having those tough conversations is how we start healing the community, building this allyship for them to be partners in advancing social justice. So for me, that's how I've been having these conversations with my family. And it's been hard because this is years and years of systematic thought and oppression, not just for the years that they've lived in America, but for all the years that they've lived in Africa, where targeted, commercialized movies and song videos have been sent to them that has deemed and vilified Black Americans to be the worst of the worst. And so you're trying to just break that systematic viewpoint of what Black Americans are in this country. So I think healing definitely starts at home, and equipping yourself to be educated and allowing yourself to have those difficult conversations.
Yeah, I've been inspired by the hashtag Black Joy stuff happening. And what we literally, to your second question, what we literally have to do, even though it's a pandemic, and even though we got to do our social distancing, our masks, and all that, literally come together. And I had some friend groups, some Black friends from college, like organize a Zoom meeting, and got like 10 of us to go on a Zoom for like an hour and a half, and that was like therapy. And I had another friend who was on that. She lives in Atlanta, and I saw her post on Instagram how they started having outdoor concerts there. And at first I was like, yo, why y'all, we still not out of the woods yet with this, right? But she said, yo, I mean, we were in our cars, we like had masks and did a social distancing, but I needed that. I needed to be outdoors. I need to be around my people. Insecure, which just wrapped up the last episode of the season. That's been like, a time for folks to come together around that show and the Black experience. And so whatever I think part of healing is also trying to figure out how there's a lot of just like the images and the protests, that takes a toll on you. But whatever you can find to remind you of your power, of your beauty, of your community's beauty and power, I think that stuff is helpful.
I agree with everything that Max and Lily said. I think for me, I've experienced complex PTSD from some of the racial trauma that I've experienced from being at PWIs, because I've been at several, and some of them very quote unquote elite. And being that tokenized Black girl, I had to go through like sexual harassment, sexual assault, a lot of different forms of abuse from those experiences. And I would say for me, the healing has been about digging deeper and understanding that some of the things that we see on the surface is only a small portion of what's going on. And so for me, my spiritual walk has helped me tremendously in understanding how to heal my spirit. Because even though I'm in the skin and I love being a Black woman, I do think that a lot of it is also spiritual warfare. And so that's one of the ways that I've been able to kind of make sense of a lot of the things that I've experienced over the short 28 years that I've been on this planet. And so if there's anyone on this Zoom chat that would like to connect in terms of if they're Christian, or even if they're not Christian, because a lot of my friends are Muslim, Hindu, I have a lot of friends of different faith, but who understand that faith can be a really big part of healing when you're dealing with something like that. So for me, it's been my faith.
A great question and great responses. Thank you so much. As I said, you guys have provided such amazing insight. We've had some really great questions. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. So Amanda is going to ask a question. For anyone who has follow-up questions that we weren't able to get to today, feel free to drop them in the chat and we can follow up afterwards sometime in the coming weeks, hopefully with some more insight into that. Amanda, to you.
Hi there, thank you all. This has been wonderful. Thank you to all the panelists, and I know we're running out of time. I work at Bain & Company, and so myself and Melissa Pena on the call, we have been partnering with Bottom Line. Unfortunately, did not get to have our externship go through because of COVID, but hoping to just extend the partnership as we move along. But my question is that, there's a lot of promises being made in corporate America, especially right now. A lot of big promises, a lot of big, commitments. but those are words right now, and we hope to see action later on. But what would success look like to you guys, with all these promises and ambitions being made in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and just overall allyship within the corporate space?
I'll just speak for myself as a non-Black person and say reparations. And I love that this is called allyship in practice, because I think it really is practice. There are a million corporations, a million elected officials saying Black Lives Matter. I want to know who's going to defund the police and move that money into schools, into housing, into healthcare, in the middle of a pandemic, into the things that nurture and grow communities. So that's my answer, but I'm sure other folks have other ones.
Amanda.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I appreciate that question, because I am actually constantly thinking about it. The reality is, to Charlene's point, those are a lot of performative statements and cover-ups, because our dollar value matters. These are companies that are coming up and stepping up and saying they care about Black lives because they know how effective our money is. But the reality is, out of the Fortune 500 companies, 4 of the CEOs are Black. That's unreal to me. And so we really need to think deep and assess what's the succession rate for Blacks to take leadership roles in these companies. Really hold our VPs, our managing directors accountable and say, who's going to take over when you leave? What's your pool looking like? Are you managing somebody? Are you championing somebody? Are you sponsoring somebody that's a person of color? And so really holding your managers and the people that you report to accountable, so that their pipeline looks a lot more diverse than it currently is. And so if we start having those tough conversations and making sure that we're increasing the pipeline for the workforce for Black people, then we really get to really uplift the community in a significant way. Because there's no reason why the CEOs, there's 4 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies.
I agree with everything that Lily said, and also Max and Lily. One of the things that I wanted to add, or at least a perspective that I've come to realize, is that I don't know if the issue is necessarily getting more people of color into positions of power, because one of the things that I've seen is and I don't want to kind of paint a broad stroke, but some of the things that I've noticed is that when people of color do get into positions of power, because we're in a white supremacist system, you adopt the ideologies of the oppressor. And so it's hard to get into positions of power and do what you want when you're in that kind of system. And I don't want it to sound hopeless, but that's kind of the conversation that I've had with my boyfriend, Dan. We talked about Obama being president for 8 years and some of the things that he probably was not able to do within those 8 years for people of color, particularly Black people. And so we had an 8-year, I would say, cover up of having a face of Blackness, but nothing actually happened, at least for me personally, for Black people. And so I don't know if it's necessarily about getting people of color as CEOs, because I think when you do get to those positions of power, there's a lot of silencing of yourself that you have to do in order to be there. So you're kind of like a model, a new form of quote unquote model minority for Blackness. So it becomes very tricky, I think, but I would say that maybe changing the culture is more important than creating more spaces for Black people. Because if we can change the culture of humanity as a whole, then we wouldn't have to adopt certain traits in order to get to positions of power. So it's a very complex question, and it's a lot to unpack, but that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, +1 on that. And the interesting thing I think about too is when you think about, because like when you're a Black CEO, you gotta make sure you can stay the CEO. So you can't pop off because your board of directors is probably mostly white, and so you gotta keep them happy. I think a lot about like even thinking about starting with the employees you have now and asking the questions like around like how to support them better, because I used to be in kind of work a little bit close to like corporate America, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out like if I was in charge of hiring, my company culture and the systems we have in place, I would not be comfortable hiring a Black person. I'm happy because I think I can find a way to kind of make it work for me because I'm already in the door. But it would be a disservice for me to know what the hell is going on in here, what the heck is going on in here, and to like invite another Black person in this culture where I know they're not going to thrive or even survive, right? And so in many cases, I spend a lot of time thinking about what can I do to change the system, change behavior, change culture, so that when Black people do come in, they can stay. And then also just like thinking about, I don't want the most senior person of color to be the head of diversity and inclusion, because the diversity and inclusion should not fall on one person. It should be integrated across departments, have resources, have money, okay? And not just like a nice to have, check the box, we have a diversity statement, and then we're good. And so I think that's important too. And then also thinking about, I think a lot about, get close to the communities that are around you. Bain has offices all over the place. Bain has a big office in Boston. Boston has some of the worst outcomes in this country. People, yeah, Democratic state, you know, all this stuff happening. The worst outcomes. Like, learn more about that, right? And figure out how can we position ourselves as a company and our employees to help close the gap, the racial wealth gap, health disparities, and all stuff in our backyard, because you're close to that, right? And even though, you know, you probably live in Back Bay, probably live on, you know, the seaport, you could learn a little bit about what's happening in Mattapan and Dorchester, okay, and how COVID is impacting certain communities over others. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions you can kind of push at your company. But the one thing that one of my political mentors who's connected to Bain actually is Deval Patrick. And Deval Patrick has this quote that says, "The woke need to make room for the still waking. We all need that grace." And that's how I operate in a lot of this work too. Like, yeah, you know, you might consider me on the higher class of woke, but I also know that like there's people who are, you know, who like have the good intentions in mind and want to be helpful and want to be part of this, but they still need, you know, some support. And like how we need to kind of, I love what Charlene was saying about love and heart and grace and all that. And I think that can't be lost in this conversation.
Thank
I
you.
agree. I'm sorry. I do agree with you, Max. I also wanted to say one more thing. Max, I had something similar to what the story that you were talking about, someone mentioning slavery or saying like, you know, we're working like slaves. I had something very similar happen to me while I was at Yale. And so I kind of wanted like to address like politics and how, you know, being a part of political parties sometimes can be like a form of slavery in many ways. I'm not, my mom is from Haiti, and we have a lot of conversations about, you know, the importance of this day, but also the importance of Haiti being the first, you know, country to, you know, get rid of slavery, the most successful revolution, but at the same time there is slavery going on right now in Haiti, right? And so understanding the connection I'm trying to make is like sometimes as Black Americans, we are on different plantations, either the Republican plantation or the Democratic plantation. And every 4 years, it's the same conversation. And so it gets very tricky, and it can get very hopeless for a lot of people in terms of like, while people say, you know, go vote, right? Go vote for Joe Biden or whatever the case may be. But is that really going to change the things that we're seeing right now, right? Will there be another situation like George Floyd maybe next year or a couple months from now, right? And so the question now becomes, is it about voting, right? Is it a political thing? So I would really recommend that people really dig deep into some of the things that we're talking about right now, because, and this is not about anyone in particular, but I think for myself, when I was going through my trauma, I had to really stay in my room and try to figure out what is really going on. So trying to see beyond politics, because I think that some of the conversations that we're having is more on the surface. And if we want to fix something so abstract as racism, I think we may need to kind of think on a deeper level. And the last thing I'm going to say, I don't know if anyone have ever seen the movie Get Out. Maybe most people have, but I think that movie, as much as it's a comedy or a horror, I think there's more in that movie than most people don't understand. And I say that as someone who was offered a lot of things at Yale University to be a professor. I was offered a lot of things and I backed out of it because of some of the things that I was able to see. And so I just recommend that. I know everyone here is on the younger end of the spectrum, but I highly recommend that people do research for themselves and not just read what's in the textbook or the books that the New York Times is saying to read, but really dig deep to see what is really going on beyond the surface.
So much information, such a heavy topic. I recognize that we're a little over time. I just want to say thank you so much to Max, Charlene, Lily, and Elizabeth for sharing with us today. You guys have provided some excellent information. As I said, feel free to drop any final questions in the chat. I did want to close us out with a very brief reflection activity. We're going to drop a link into the chat to a Google Doc. I would love it if you guys could just go on the document and write like a one-word reflection of how you're feeling about this panel, about this day. If you've been with us all day or if you're just tuning in, just one word that sort of sums up your response. And then of course, read through other people's reflections. If you see any that resonate with you, go ahead and put a star next to them, just so that we have just a little insight into how y'all are feeling. While that happens in the background, I just want to quickly do some shout outs and thank yous. First and foremost, I want to shout out Susan Shepard from our national office, who helped me with project management, finalizing content, all things email. She was a huge help in keeping me on task and organized, so I really appreciate her for that. Definitely need to shout out Liz Foster and Gianna Mangianaro out of Massachusetts. All the tech, all the things, as well as helping me secure panelists for our awesome panel on allyship and practice. So huge thank you to them. My friend Catherine Smith from our New York office, who presented the history of Juneteenth during the first session, as well as recorded notes all throughout the day for me. I appreciate her for that. I'm Steve Colon from National, our CEO, of course, for championing this idea with our senior leadership team, as well as starting the conversation of where Bottom Line can do better in terms of not upholding some of those racist structures that we see in places of work, particularly as we work with students primarily of color. Lo Johnson in New York and Terrell James in Chicago, who helps me get the word out to people. I appreciate them so much. Couldn't have done it without them. And of course, I have to shout out Jeanette from New York, Ye from New York, and Kamala from New York, who've also helped me with keeping records, note-taking, who will help me with sharing out after the event. And of course, I need to thank everyone in attendance today. It's been really great to see a rallying of support around the Black community and Bottom Line, and interest in engaging in thoughtful and constructive dialogue about how to be better. I do hope that from our conversations, you see that it's not just about being better, it's about doing better. So action. I hope you're all able to leave today with some food for thought and active ways to to move the needle forward, to continue having conversation, not just with the people of color in your office or your inner circle, but with your family and friends and the larger communities that you move in. So I want to go ahead and thank you all for joining Bottom Line today, for joining me in community. And that wraps up our official programming, what has been a day full of celebration and uplifting of Black voices and reflection. So thank you all so much for joining. I see we have some great reflection notes. Go ahead and keep reflecting as you see fit and starring things. So I appreciate you all.